A few lines. That is all it took. Not an empire. Not a buried city. Not a golden idol pulled from the sand. Just a short, cryptic text claiming to reveal how reality itself is built. The Emerald Tablet was said to contain the secret of transformation. Heaven mirrored in earth, spirit hidden in matter, the universe compressed into a formula small enough to hold in the hand. For centuries, alchemists treated it not as poetry, but as a key. And keys, in the wrong hands, have always made people nervous. But before we follow the tablet through libraries, legends, furnaces, and forbidden margins, we need to slow down. Because the first mystery is not whether an emerald slab truly waited somewhere in the ancient darkness. The first mystery is why so many serious minds believed that a text this brief could open the deepest machinery of nature. Imagine encountering it not as a modern reader, but as someone living in a world where metals seem to grow inside the earth, planets influenced the body, and every natural process hinted at a hidden intelligence. In that world, the Emerald Tablet did not sound like nonsense. It sounded like a message written in code, calm, compressed, almost indifferent to whether you were worthy of understanding it. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Tonight, we begin with the object that may never have existed as legend describes it, and the words that undeniably did. To understand why the Emerald Tablet carried such authority, we have to meet the name attached to it. Hermes Trismegistus, not a man in the ordinary sense, not someone we can follow through a clean timeline, with a birthplace, a teacher, a death, and a grave. Hermes Trismegistus belongs to a stranger category, the kind of figure history creates when cultures overlap, when gods are translated into one another, and when knowledge needs a face old enough to command obedience. His name means Hermes thrice great, and that greatness was not modest. Later traditions imagined him as a master of writing, measurement, magic, astrology, medicine, and the hidden laws that connected the visible world to the invisible one. He was not merely a wise author, he was the supposed origin of wisdom itself. Behind him stood two older figures. From Egypt came Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, calculation, sacred speech, and cosmic order. Thoth was the one who measured, recorded, and preserved. He belonged to the world of scribes and temples, to the careful keeping of time, ritual, and divine balance. In Egyptian imagination, writing was never just a practical tool. Words could stabilize the world. Names had force. Correct speech could matter almost as much as correct action. From Greece came Hermes, messenger, interpreter, traveler between boundaries. Hermes moved between gods and mortals, between the living and the dead, between the known road and the hidden path. He was clever, quick, slippery, and unusually comfortable at thresholds. Where Thoth suggested sacred record and cosmic measure, Hermes suggested movement, translation, and secret exchange. When Greek and Egyptian worlds came into contact, especially after the conquests and settlements that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean, these two figures began to blur. The Greeks recognized something Hermes-like in Thoth. Egyptians could see something Thoth-like in Hermes. The result was not a simple replacement, but a fusion. Hermes Trismegistus, a symbolic teacher who seemed to stand behind every art that required hidden understanding. That is important, because the Emerald Tablet did not become powerful only because of what it said. It became powerful because of who was believed to have said it. A short, obscure text on its own can be dismissed, but place it in the mouth of the legendary master of sacred writing and cosmic science, and suddenly obscurity becomes a sign of depth. Difficulty becomes proof of importance. If the words are hard to understand, perhaps that is because they are protecting something. This is one of the oldest tricks in the history of esoteric knowledge, though calling it a trick may be unfair. Ancient and medieval readers often valued antiquity differently than we do. Today we ask, can we verify the author? Can we date the manuscript? Can we trace the transmission? But for many earlier seekers, the deepest truth was assumed to be old, not new, not innovative, old, close to creation, close to the gods, close to a time before knowledge had been scattered, diluted, and argued into fragments. So Hermes Trismegistus became a kind of guarantee. His name told the reader that the text was not merely someone's opinion. It came wrapped in the aura of a primordial science, a wisdom older than ordinary philosophy, older than ordinary religion, perhaps older than history as written by men. Of course, this is where caution matters. We do not have good evidence that Hermes Trismegistus was a historical individual who personally wrote the Emerald Tablet. The figure is legendary, composite, and layered. He belongs to the imagination of late antique and medieval intellectual culture, far more than to the biography of a single person. But legends can still do real work. Sometimes a name becomes a vessel, carrying ideas across centuries, even when the person behind the name dissolves. And Hermes was the perfect vessel. He stood at the meeting point of science and magic, mathematics and myths, language and matter. He was the patron of the very confusion that alchemy would later inhabit. Not confusion as stupidity, but confusion as mixture. The alchemist's world did not separate cleanly into chemistry over here, religion over there, medicine in one cabinet, astrology in another. These were threads in the same fabric. Hermes, with one foot in Egypt and one in Greece, gave that fabric a voice. This is why the tablet could speak so strangely and still be heard. Its sentences were compact, almost severe. They did not explain themselves. They gave the impression of being translated from something older than ordinary speech, as if the words had survived a long journey and arrived carrying only their essential bones. To a skeptical reader, that can feel like vagueness. To an initiate, it can feel like compression. The difference between nonsense and revelation often depends on whether you believe the speaker has authority. Hermes supplied that authority, and yet there is something more interesting here than simple belief. The legend of Hermes Trismegistus reveals a deep human desire, the desire for knowledge to have an origin, not just a method, not just a library, an origin, a first teacher, a voice before the arguments began. Alchemy, especially in its hermetic form, was haunted by this desire. It wanted to believe that beneath the variety of metals, planets, bodies, medicines, and spiritual states, there was one grammar. And if there was one grammar, perhaps there had once been one grammarian, a master who understood the whole sentence of the cosmos. Hermes Trismegistus was that imagined master. He allowed later readers to picture knowledge not as a pile of separate discoveries, but as a lost inheritance. Something given, hidden, damaged, translated, misread, and partially recovered. That idea is powerful because it changes the emotional texture of learning. You are not merely studying. You are recovering. You are not simply experimenting. You are listening for a voice that has been muffled by time. This does not make the legend true in a literal sense, but it explains why the legend endured. The Emerald Tablet needed more than an author. It needed an ancestor. Hermes gave it one, and once that name was attached, the text could travel with a strange kind of protection. It could pass from language to language, from Muslim scholars to Latin translators, from manuscript collections into Renaissance studies, not as a curiosity, but as a fragment of primeval instruction, a small document with an impossibly large shadow. The irony is that Hermes Trismegistus, the supposed guardian of hidden certainty, is himself uncertain. He is a mask made from older masks, a voice assembled from cultures trying to understand one another. But perhaps that is exactly why he suited the Emerald Tablet so well. A text about correspondence, transformation, and unity was attributed to a figure born from correspondence, transformation, and unity. The messenger and the scribe became one, and through that invented voice, the tablet began to sound ancient enough to be believed. Long before the Emerald Tablet entered medieval manuscripts, before Hermes Trismegistus became a master name for hidden wisdom, there was Egypt. Not the fantasy Egypt of treasure curses and theatrical smoke, but the older, stranger, more disciplined Egypt that later generations could never quite stop imagining. It is easy to misunderstand why Egypt mattered so much to alchemists. The simple version says that Egypt was mysterious, and therefore people projected secrets onto it. That is partly true. Distance always helps legend grow. A civilization with pyramids, temples, animal-headed gods, sealed tombs, sacred scripts, and a priesthood trained in difficult knowledge was almost guaranteed to become a screen for later dreams. But reducing Egypt to exotic scenery misses the deeper reason it became so important. Egypt looked, to later observers, like a civilization where the sacred and the technical had never been fully separated. Temple ritual was not just worship. It involved timing, measurement, purification, recitation, architecture, astronomy, materials, images, and carefully preserved procedures. Medicine was not just a list of herbs and wounds. It could sit beside prayers, incantations, and ideas about divine order. Metallurgy was not simply craft. The transformation of substances, ore into metal, mineral pigments into sacred color, resins into embalming compounds, took place in a culture that already thought symbolically about death, renewal, preservation, and rebirth. For the later alchemical imagination, this mattered enormously. Alchemy would eventually become obsessed with processes that looked both physical and spiritual: blackening, whitening, reddening, dissolving, separating, recombining, purifying. These were laboratory actions, but they were also moral and cosmic metaphors. Egypt seemed to offer a world where that double meaning was natural. A substance could be practical and sacred at the same time. A ritual object could be a material technology. A measured star could also be a sign in a divine order. That does not mean Egyptian priests were secretly writing medieval alchemical manuals in temple basements. The evidence does not allow that. We should be careful here. because the story can easily become too smooth. Later, alchemists often imagined Egypt as the birthplace of secret science, but imagination is not the same as documentation. What we can say more responsibly is that Egypt provided a powerful model, a society in which knowledge appeared ancient, guarded, symbolic, and materially skilled. And sometimes, the appearance of a model is enough to shape centuries. Think about embalming, for example. To preserve a body against decay is not alchemy in the later technical sense, but to someone looking back through the fog of time, it could seem like mastery over corruption itself. The body, which should collapse back into nature, is treated, dried, wrapped, perfumed, sealed, and made ready for another form of existence. The process is chemical, religious, and political all at once. It says that matter is not passive. Matter can be prepared. Matter can be disciplined. Matter can be made to cross a threshold. That is very close to the emotional center of alchemy. Or consider the Egyptian relationship with color and mineral substances, blue and green pigments, gold surfaces, black fertile earth, red desert. These were not neutral decorations. Materials carried associations. Gold did not merely shine, it suggested incorruptibility, solar power, divine flesh. Black was not only darkness, it could be the rich black silt of rebirth. Green could speak of growth and renewal. In such a world, matter already seemed to possess a vocabulary. Later, alchemy would take that intuition and turn it inward. Metals would have temperaments. Planets would have correspondences. Sulfur and mercury would become more than ingredients. They would become principles. The world of matter would become readable, almost linguistic. This is why Egypt became more than a place. It became an argument. For the alchemist, Egypt could be used to argue that the oldest wisdom was not abstract philosophy alone. It was practical. It had furnaces, knives, vessels, measurements, medicines, inks, stones, oils, and carefully prepared substances. It touched things. It cut, heated, mixed, sealed, and preserved. And yet, it did not lose the sense that these actions belonged inside a cosmic order. Modern people often divide knowledge into categories so automatically that we forget those categories have histories. Religion, science, magic, medicine, astronomy, craft. We speak as though these are separate rooms with locked doors between them. Ancient Egypt did not arrange the furniture in quite that way. Its temples could be observatories of time, houses of ritual, centers of writing, repositories of medical and mathematical tradition, and workshops of sacred material culture. To later Hermetic writers, this made Egypt feel like the original laboratory of the sacred. Of course, that phrase needs care. A laboratory, in the modern sense, suggests controlled experiment, instruments, published results, methods designed for replication. That is not what ancient Egyptian temples were. But if we use the word more loosely, as a place where matter, symbol, and disciplined procedure met, then Egypt becomes a powerful ancestor to the alchemical imagination. Not the literal birthplace of every later doctrine, not proof of an unbroken secret chain, but a landscape where the idea of sacred transformation already made sense. And here the myth of Hermes becomes clearer. A figure born from Thoth and Hermes could only have emerged in a world where writing, calculation, ritual, and hidden knowledge were already charged with power. Hermes Trismegistus did not float above history as pure invention. He condensed real cultural memories, the Egyptian prestige of sacred scribes, the Greek fascination with wisdom from older civilizations, and the later hunger for a single source behind many kinds of knowledge. The Emerald Tablet inherited that atmosphere. When later readers imagined its words carved on emerald, they were not simply picturing a pretty green stone. They were placing the text inside a symbolic Egypt, green with renewal, stone with permanence, hidden chambers with initiation, ancient writing with authority. Whether the object existed mattered less, emotionally, than the world it evoked. That is one reason the legend became so resilient. It did not have to prove itself in the way modern evidence demands. It satisfied a different need. It gave alchemy a homeland, not a normal homeland, with borders and tax records, but a spiritual geography. Egypt became the place where matter first learned to speak in symbols, the place where the heavens were measured, the dead were preserved, metals gleamed like divine substances, and writing itself seemed capable of holding cosmic order in lines and signs. This is not the Egypt of easy fantasy. It is more interesting than that. It is a remembered Egypt, a reconstructed Egypt, a misunderstood Egypt, and beneath all of that, a real civilization whose ways of joining ritual and technique gave later seekers a language for their own ambitions. The Emerald Tablet may not have come from an ancient Egyptian slab, but without the idea of Egypt, it would not have sounded nearly so ancient when it finally began to speak. If Egypt gave alchemy its sacred landscape, Alexandria gave it a crossroads. There are cities that become important because armies seize them, or merchants enrich them, or rulers make them beautiful. Alexandria became something more unstable and more fertile, a meeting place where different ways of reading the universe were forced into conversation. Egyptian temple traditions, Greek philosophy, Jewish interpretation, astrology, medicine, mathematics, and practical work with substances all passed near one another there. Not always peacefully, not always neatly, but close enough for ideas to borrow each other's clothing. That is the atmosphere in which Hermetic thought becomes easier to understand. Alexandria was not simply a city with books, though books mattered. It was a city where knowledge could be translated, argued over, renamed, and recombined. A Greek philosophical idea might sit beside an Egyptian religious image. A medical recipe might circulate near an astrological theory. A Jewish reading of creation might meet a Platonic language of divine mind and cosmic order. A craftsman's knowledge of dyes, metals, glass, or minerals might be interpreted through a much grander symbolic system. This is where the story becomes less about one hidden text and more about an intellectual climate. The Emerald Tablet, when it finally appears in traceable written form much later, carries the smell of that climate. It speaks in compressed correspondences. It assumes that above and below are linked. It imagines reality as layered but not broken. The heavenly world and the earthly world are not strangers. They are related, perhaps even mirrors. That kind of thinking did not need one inventor. It needed a world where many traditions were already asking similar questions in different languages. How does the divine enter matter? How does the visible world express invisible order? Can the human mind rise toward the structure of the cosmos? Can a substance be changed in a way that reveals what it always secretly was? These were not laboratory questions only. They belonged equally to philosophy, ritual, medicine, astrology, and theology. Alexandria made such overlap feel possible. We should be careful not to turn the city into a fantasy machine, where every ancient mystery was solved in a single candlelit room. That is the tourist version of intellectual history, and it is usually too convenient. Real contact between traditions is messier. People misunderstand each other. They translate poorly. They preserve some things and distort others. They use old names to authorize new ideas. They argue. They simplify. They exaggerate. But that messiness is exactly what makes Alexandria important. A perfectly sealed tradition does not create Hermeticism. A mixed one does. Hermetic thought grew from the belief that the universe was intelligible, but not obvious. It could be read, but not by the careless. It required symbols, discipline, purification, and a certain kind of inward transformation. This is where Greek philosophy contributed something crucial. It gave seekers a language for hierarchy, matter and spirit, body and soul, visible and invisible, lower and higher. It encouraged the idea that reality had levels and that the human mind could ascend through them. Egyptian religious memory gave that ascent an older and more mysterious costume. The authority of priests, sacred writing, temple ritual, and cosmic order gave philosophical speculation a sense of ancient weight. Jewish and other Near Eastern traditions contributed powerful habits of interpretation. The idea that texts, names, and creation itself might conceal deeper meanings beneath the surface. Astrology added a grand architecture linking human life to the movements of heaven. Medicine and early chemical practice kept all of this from floating away into pure abstraction. Because bodies still got sick, metals still changed in fire, and substances still behaved in ways that demanded attention. The result was not modern science. It was also not mere superstition. It was a serious attempt to live in a world where everything appeared connected. That word, connected, is easy to flatten. Today it can sound like vague spirituality. But in the ancient and late antique imagination, connection could be a disciplined principle. If the stars moved in ordered patterns, if the body had rhythms, if plants affected illness, if metals changed under heat, if sacred words altered ritual space, then perhaps nature was not a pile of unrelated facts. Perhaps it was a system of sympathies. Sympathy, in this older sense, did not mean kindness. It meant hidden relationship. One thing answered another. The heavens answered the earth. The body answered the cosmos. A mineral might answer a planet. A ritual action might answer a divine pattern. This is the kind of world in which a sentence like, "as above, so below," could feel less like a slogan and more like a method. And yet, for all its grandeur, the Alexandrian atmosphere also introduced a problem that would follow alchemy for centuries. When everything is connected, interpretation becomes dangerous. A symbol can illuminate, but it can also mislead. A correspondence can reveal a pattern, or it can tempt the mind into seeing patterns everywhere. The same habit that allows a thoughtful reader to connect metal and planet, body and soul, furnace and cosmos, can also build castles out of smoke. That tension is part of the Emerald Tablet's long life. It promises order, but it does not give easy instructions. It invites interpretation, but refuses to police the interpreter. This made it powerful. It also made it endlessly reusable. Philosophers could see metaphysics in it. Alchemists could see laboratory process. Spiritual writers could see the purification of the soul. Occult thinkers could see a map of hidden forces. Skeptics could see poetic vagueness dressed up as authority. The tablet survived partly because it could bear all of these readings without breaking. Alexandria helps explain how such a text could become plausible. In a city shaped by translation and mixture, wisdom did not have to belong to only one tradition. Greek concepts could be placed in Egyptian mouths. Egyptian gods could be interpreted through Greek names. Sacred history could be reread as philosophy. Practical craft could be elevated into cosmic art. The result was a culture of intellectual layering. Hermes Trismegistus is almost a personification of that layering. He is not simply Thoth plus Hermes, as though two statues were melted down and poured into one mold. He is what happens when cultures decide that their different symbols may be pointing toward the same hidden teacher. He is translation turned into a prophet. And in that sense, Alexandria did something more important than preserve secrets. It created the conditions under which secrecy itself became meaningful. A hidden teaching is only attractive when people believe there is a hidden order worth teaching. Alexandria's mixed world offered that belief again and again. Its thinkers and practitioners did not always agree on what the order was, but they shared the suspicion that surface appearances were incomplete. The world showed one face to ordinary sight and another to those trained to read. This suspicion is the doorway through which the Emerald Tablet eventually enters history. Not yet as a firmly documented object, not yet as the famous text copied by alchemists across continents, but as a possibility. The possibility that a few sentences could contain a whole cosmology, that an ancient voice could speak across languages, that matter, properly understood, was not dead stuff but a participant in a larger drama of descent, ascent, separation, and return. Alexandria did not need to produce the tablet directly for this to matter. Its legacy was broader. It taught later worlds how to imagine a text like the tablet. Brief, authoritative, symbolic, ancient, and demanding interpretation. In the Egyptian temple, knowledge had seemed sacred. In Alexandria, it became hybrid. And once knowledge became hybrid, it could travel farther than any single tradition that helped create it. At the center of the Emerald Tablet's legend is a scene that feels almost too perfectly designed to survive. A seeker enters a hidden chamber beneath a statue. The air is sealed away from ordinary life. The world above continues with its noise, its markets, its politics, its weather. But below, in the artificial stillness of a place made for secrets, an ancient figure waits. In some versions of the Arabic tradition, the seeker is Balinus, often identified with Apollonius of Tyana in later transmission. A wandering sage surrounded by stories of wisdom, marvels, and forbidden knowledge. He descends. He finds a body, or an enthroned figure, ancient and unmoving. In its hands is a tablet, and on that tablet are the words that will become one of the most famous fragments in alchemical history. It is a magnificent image. That is probably why it worked. The story gives the tablet everything a secret text could want. Darkness, descent, a buried chamber, a silent guardian, an object placed in the hands of the dead, and a reader daring enough to cross the boundary. The knowledge is not discovered in daylight. It is not taught in a classroom. It is recovered from below, as though wisdom must be taken from the underworld of memory. But this is also where a careful storyteller has to lower the lantern a little. The hidden chamber scene belongs to textual legend. It is not confirmed archaeology. We do not possess a verified emerald slab recovered from beneath an Egyptian statue, still less one held by Hermes himself. The power of the tale lies not in its historical certainty, but in the way it stages the act of discovering ancient knowledge. And staging matters. Every culture has ways of making knowledge feel legitimate. Some point to divine revelation, some to ancestral tradition, some to experiment, some to mathematical proof. The Belinus legend uses a different form of authority: recovery. The truth is already old. It has already been written. The modern seeker's task is not to invent it, but to find it, enter the right hidden place, and read what others have lost. That is a very different emotional experience from learning. Learning suggests effort over time. Recovery suggests destiny. The chamber beneath the statue turns the emerald tablet into a rescued inheritance. Its secrecy becomes part of its proof. Why would such a text be hidden unless it was dangerous, precious, or both? Why would it be guarded by an ancient figure unless it belonged to a wisdom older than ordinary human memory? The legend answers these questions before the reader can ask them. It tells us that the tablet was not merely composed, it was concealed. It was not merely preserved. It was waiting. This is one reason the story feels so cinematic even now. It understands the psychology of revelation. The descent beneath the statue is a physical version of what the alchemist hopes to do intellectually. Go below the surface, pass beneath appearances, enter the hidden architecture, find the formula held in the hands of a figure who no longer speaks. The statue itself matters as a symbol. A statue is already a strange object, shaped like a body, but not alive, fixed in time, but representing something beyond itself. To place a chamber beneath it is to suggest that visible forms have hidden interiors. What you see above ground is only the marker. The real content lies below. That is almost a perfect metaphor for Hermetic reading. The world is the statue. Nature is the visible surface. Beneath it lies the chamber of causes. The seeker must learn how to descend. Belinus, in the legend, becomes more than a character. He becomes the model reader. He is not the author of the truth. He is the one who dares to retrieve it. And this distinction matters because many esoteric traditions prefer discovery to authorship. Authorship can seem too human. Discovery suggests the teaching existed before the discoverer, perhaps before history itself. Of course, from a modern historical point of view, that is exactly what makes the tale suspicious. Stories of ancient books found in tombs, caves, statues, temples, or sealed chambers often function as origin myths. They explain why a text should be trusted when its actual composition is uncertain, late, or difficult to trace. By giving a document a dramatic discovery, the tradition gives it a past deep enough to silence doubt. That does not make the people who repeated the story fools. It means they understood something about authority. A text without a clear origin can seem weak. A text found beneath a statue in the hands of an ancient sage seems almost impossible to challenge, at least within the imaginative rules of the tradition. And the emerald tablet needed that aura. Its actual content is brief, dense, and not especially generous to the casual reader. It does not introduce itself politely. It does not explain its vocabulary. It speaks as if the reader has arrived late to a conversation that began before the world was divided into ordinary categories. The discovery legend solves this problem by telling us how to approach it. not as a normal document, but as something recovered from a place where normal documents do not live. There is also a subtle drama in the figure of Belinus himself. Later tradition often associates him with Apollonius of Tyana, a philosopher and wonder-working sage whose reputation grew far beyond what firm evidence can easily support. That makes him useful in precisely the same way Hermes is useful. He stands near the border between history and legend. He is recognizable enough to anchor the story, mysterious enough to carry it. The tablet, then, is framed by two ambiguous figures, Hermes, the supposed ancient voice, and Belinus, the legendary discoverer. One gives the text origin, the other gives it transmission. Between them sits the chamber, the place where hidden knowledge crosses from silence into speech. This is not history in the modern archival sense. It is mythic historiography, a way of telling the past so that a text's meaning, authority, and danger all arrive together. And yet, even if the chamber was never real, the scene reveals something true about the tradition that preserved it. Alchemy loved thresholds. It loved sealed vessels, buried metals, hidden seeds, secret fires, cryptic names, and substances that had to be broken down before they could be perfected. The legend of the tablet's discovery follows the same pattern. Knowledge itself is sealed away like a substance in a vessel. The seeker opens it, and something begins to transform. The important question is not simply, did Belinus really find the tablet beneath a statue? The better question is, why did alchemists need the story to look this way? Because the answer tells us how they understood wisdom, not as information freely available to anyone, not as public knowledge waiting on a shelf, but as something buried beneath surfaces, guarded by symbols, and accessible only through risk, discipline, and interpretation. The hidden chamber is almost certainly not where the Emerald Tablet began as a historical document, but it may be where the tablet began as a legend powerful enough to travel. It gave readers an image to remember before they even understood the words. And sometimes, an image can carry a doctrine farther than an argument. A man descends. A silent figure waits. A tablet rests in ancient hands. The scene may not tell us where the text truly came from, but it tells us exactly how the text wanted to be read. The hidden chamber gives us the legend. Now we come to the more difficult thing, the evidence. And the evidence does not lead us first to a gleaming slab in ancient Egypt. It leads us into Arabic alchemical tradition, into manuscripts, translations, and intellectual networks where older Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern materials were being preserved, reworked, and given new life. That shift matters. It changes the story from a treasure discovery into a history of transmission. For a long time, the Emerald Tablet was imagined as something impossibly ancient, almost prehistorical in its authority. The legend wanted us to see it as a remnant from the first age of wisdom. But when historians ask where the text can actually be traced, the trail becomes more modest and, in some ways, more interesting. The earliest recoverable forms of the tablet appear not as an excavated Egyptian object, but within the Arabic-speaking world of medieval alchemy. This does not make the tablet less mysterious. It makes the mystery more human, because now we are no longer dealing with a single miraculous object. We are dealing with scribes, scholars, translators, compilers, readers, and practitioners. People who copied difficult texts by hand. People who inherited fragments of Greek philosophy and late antique speculation. people who worked with medicine, minerals, astrology, and laboratory techniques. People who did not see contradiction in studying Aristotle, invoking Hermes, preparing substances, and searching for hidden principles in nature. In that world, the Emerald Tablet found its first firm historical footing. The Arabic intellectual environment was not a passive storage room for ancient knowledge, though it has too often been treated that way in simplified histories. It was active, selective, inventive. Texts were translated, yes, but also interpreted. Systems were compared. Technical vocabularies were created. Recipes were tested, rearranged, and explained through broader theories of matter. Older authorities were honored, but they were also made useful for new questions. This is where the tablet begins to look less like a relic and more like a seed. A very short text can travel easily. It can be inserted into larger works. It can be quoted, commented on, attributed, retranslated, and adapted. Its brevity is part of its survival strategy. A long book can be lost, ignored, or difficult to copy. A dense paragraph with the name of Hermes attached to it can slip through centuries like a sealed message. But its brevity also creates danger. The fewer words a text contains, the more work readers must do around it. Every phrase becomes heavy. Every image becomes expandable. The sun is its father. The moon is its mother. The wind carried it. The earth nourished it. Such language refuses to stay in one category. Is this cosmology? Is it chemistry? Is it spiritual allegory? Is it a coded laboratory instruction? Is it a philosophical poem? Arabic alchemical culture did not need to choose only one answer. That is one of the reasons the tablet could flourish there. The intellectual world that received it was comfortable with layered meaning. It understood that ancient names could authorize difficult ideas. It allowed symbolic language to stand beside practical operations. A furnace could be real and also a metaphor. A substance could be material and also a sign of something greater. Still, we should not imagine every Arabic alchemist reading the tablet in the same way. There was no single uniform alchemical mind. There were compilers, experimenters, philosophers, mystics, physicians, and writers with different levels of seriousness and skill. Some may have valued the tablet as a technical key, others as a hermetic statement of cosmic unity. Others may have preserved it because it came attached to a powerful name and belonged to a respected tradition. The important point is that the Arabic setting gave the tablet a written life. A legend can float orally, changing shape each time it is retold. A manuscript fixes a version, even if only temporarily. It allows later readers to copy the wording, argue with it, compare it, and translate it. Once the tablet entered manuscript culture, it became not just a story about hidden wisdom, but an object of interpretation. That may sound less dramatic than Balinas descending into a chamber, but in historical terms, it is more consequential. A buried tablet can inspire one discovery. A copied text can inspire a civilization of readers. And the Arabic-speaking world was uniquely positioned to make such a text travel. It stood across trade routes, scholarly centers, courts, libraries, and translation movements. Greek philosophical works, medical treatises, astrological doctrines, mathematical traditions, and practical craft knowledge all circulated in new forms. The old world was not simply preserved, it was reorganized. Alchemy benefited from this reorganization. It gained vocabulary, it gained theory, It gained commentary. It gained a wider intellectual stage. The transformation of matter could now be discussed not only as craft practice, but as part of a grander philosophy of nature. What are metals? How do qualities change? What causes generation and corruption? Can nature be accelerated? Can art imitate or perfect nature? These questions gave alchemy ambition. The emerald tablet fit into that ambition because it spoke as if the universe had one hidden operation. It suggested that the same principle could explain ascent and descent, separation and union, heaven and earth. Its language was not a manual in the modern sense. It did not tell the reader to heat this substance at this temperature for this number of hours. Instead, it offered a pattern, and alchemy was hungry for patterns. Here, the difference between evidence and legend becomes especially useful. The legend says the tablet was found whole, ancient, and waiting. The evidence suggests the text emerged into history through a living culture of compilation and interpretation. One gives us an image of sudden revelation. The other gives us a process. And if we are honest, the process may be the more revealing story. It shows how wisdom is actually made durable, not by remaining pure and untouched, but by being copied, translated, reframed, and argued over. A text survives because communities keep finding uses for it. They attach it to respected names. They fold it into larger systems. They make it speak to new problems. The emerald tablet's power did not depend on being physically carved in emerald. It depended on being readable enough to invite interpretation, obscure enough to resist exhaustion, and authoritative enough to deserve copying. Arabic alchemical tradition gave it all three. This also explains why later European readers could misunderstand its age. By the time the tablet moved into Latin traditions, it already carried the aura of Hermes, Egypt, secrecy, and ancient science. Its Arabic manuscript history did not strip away those associations. It transmitted them. A Latin reader encountering the text might see not a medieval Arabic witness, but a doorway into primordial antiquity. That mistake was productive. Historically, it blurred the text's origin. Imaginatively, it magnified its force. And so the tablet stands at a crossroads between what can be traced and what was believed. The historian sees manuscript transmission. The alchemist sees ancient revelation. The storyteller sees both, because the life of the emerald tablet depends on the friction between them. A text does not need to be as old as its legend to become old in the human imagination. It only needs to pass through enough hands that no single age can fully claim it. By the time the emerald tablet entered written history, it was already wearing a mask, perhaps several. Egyptian memory, Hermetic authority, Arabic scholarship, alchemical secrecy. Each layer made the text harder to locate, but easier to revere, and that is the strange gift of the Arabic shadows. They do not reveal a simple beginning. They reveal the moment when a legend became literature, when a few cryptic lines stopped being merely attributed to ancient wisdom and began their documented journey through the minds of the living. The most famous idea associated with the emerald tablet is usually reduced to 5 words: as above, so below. It has become a slogan now. You can find it printed on jewelry, book covers, posters, tattoos, and the occasional social media caption floating over a photograph of the moon. It is often treated as a decorative phrase, a mystical way of saying that everything is connected. But for alchemists, the idea was not decorative. It was a method of reading the world. The tablet's central claim is that what happens in the higher realm is reflected in the lower, and what happens below participates in the order above. Heaven and earth are not separate kingdoms with no communication between them. They correspond. They answer each other. The visible world is not an accident or a pile of unrelated objects. It is a mirror system, and the task of the wise is to understand how the mirrors are arranged. This is not how modern science usually speaks. Today, we are trained to be suspicious of resemblance. Just because two things look alike does not mean they are causally connected. A walnut may resemble a brain, but that does not prove nature designed it as medicine for the mind. A planet may shine red in the sky, but that does not mean it rules blood, war, iron, or anger. Modern skepticism has good reasons for saying this. But to understand alchemy, we have to enter a world where resemblance was not dismissed so quickly. Similarity could be a clue. Pattern could suggest relationship. The cosmos was imagined as ordered through hidden sympathies, and those sympathies could link stars, metals, organs, plants, colors, seasons, temperaments, and spiritual states. The universe was not silent matter. It was more like a language written in multiple scripts at once. If heaven and earth mirrored one another, then the alchemist's furnace was not merely a workplace. It was a small cosmos. Inside the vessel, substances rose, condensed, darkened, brightened, separated, and joined. Vapors ascended like spirits. Liquids fell back like rain. Solids dissolved and reappeared in altered forms. To an alchemical imagination, this was not just chemical behavior. It was a miniature drama of creation. Ascent and descent, death and renewal, chaos and order. The laboratory became a stage where cosmic processes could be repeated under human attention. That is the real force of as above, so below. It gave the alchemist permission to believe that small operations could reveal large truths. By watching matter transform in a sealed vessel, one might glimpse the way nature transforms everywhere. By purifying a metal, one might understand purification in the soul. By separating a substance into parts and recombining it, one might imitate the hidden rhythm by which the universe itself unfolds. The idea is grand, but also dangerous. Because once the world becomes a mirror, almost anything can be made to reflect anything else. A disciplined correspondence can become insight. An undisciplined one becomes fantasy. This is the weakness built into the beauty of Hermetic thought. It can notice relationships that a colder system might miss. It can also invent relationships where none exist. Alchemy lived inside that tension. Its better minds were not simply daydreaming among symbols. They observed real transformations. They worked with metals, minerals, acids, distillation, heat, color change, residue, vapor, crystallization, and decay. They knew matter could surprise them, but they interpreted those surprises through a symbolic universe much larger than the experiment itself. To them, the furnace was not isolated from the stars. Gold was not just a metal, it belonged to the sun. Silver belonged to the moon. Iron could be linked to Mars. These associations were not casual decorations. They helped organize the alchemical imagination. Metals became earthly expressions of celestial principles. The sky was not far away. It was hidden inside matter. This is why the tablet's language could feel so authoritative. It did not offer a recipe. It offered a map of relations. The alchemist reading it might think, if the same law governs above and below, then the path to wisdom is not escape from the material world, but deeper entry into it. Matter is not low in the sense of worthless. It is low in the sense of concealed. It is the lower mirror of a higher order. That is a subtle but important difference. Many people imagine alchemy as a crude attempt to turn lead into gold because gold was valuable. That is the cartoon version, and like many cartoons, it survives because it contains a small piece of truth. Some alchemists certainly cared about wealth. Patrons certainly cared about it. Fraud existed. Ambition existed. Human beings did not become less human because they used Latin or wore robes. But the Hermetic vision made gold more than a payday. Gold represented perfection, incorruptibility, solar completion. To produce gold, in the highest alchemical imagination, was not merely to become rich. It was to prove that nature's hidden tendency toward perfection could be understood and assisted. The metal became evidence of a cosmic principle. The operation below confirmed the order above, and this is where the phrase becomes almost unsettling. As above, so below does not only join heaven and earth, it also joins the human being to both. If the cosmos is reflected in matter, and matter is reflected in the body, and the body is joined to the soul, then transformation cannot remain outside the practitioner. The alchemist is not a neutral observer standing safely apart from the process. The one who works on the substance is also being worked upon by the work. This is one reason alchemical writings often sound as though they are describing two things at once. A metal is purified, and so is the mind. A substance dies, and so does the old self. Something descends into darkness, rises again, and returns changed. The language is not always clear because the operation itself is imagined as double, material and spiritual, outer and inner. The emerald tablet gave this doubleness a compact foundation. Above and below, inner and outer, macrocosm and microcosm, world and human, the great and the small. The idea is ancient in feeling, but its survival tells us something very modern about ourselves. Human beings still search for patterns that make our lives feel embedded in a larger order. We still want the events of the body, the mind, the sky, and the earth to belong to one story. Even when we reject old astrology or alchemical correspondences, the desire behind them remains recognizable. We do not like living in a universe of fragments. The emerald tablet endured because it promised that the fragments were not final. The stars, the metals, the winds, the body, the soul, the hidden heat inside the vessel, all of them might be expressions of one architecture. The world might be readable, if only one learned the correct grammar. But the tablet did not give that grammar plainly. It gave a principle and left centuries of readers to test, stretch, misuse, refine, and dream through it. As above, so below became powerful because it was simple enough to remember and deep enough to never finish interpreting. It could guide careful thought or excuse wild speculation. It could dignify experiment or decorate illusion. It could make the universe feel alive with meaning, while also tempting the mind to confuse meaning with proof. That is why the phrase should not be treated as a harmless ornament. It is the hinge of an entire worldview, a worldview in which the sky leans down into the earth, matter remembers the stars, and the smallest sealed vessel might contain a reflection of the whole created world. Behind the emerald tablet's mirror of heaven and earth lies an even stranger claim. All things come from one thing. The phrase is easy to pass over because it sounds almost peaceful, as if the tablet is offering a gentle spiritual motto about unity. But in alchemical hands, this was not just a comforting idea. It was an operating principle. If all things emerged from one source, then nature was not a warehouse of separate objects. It was a single process wearing different forms. That changes everything. A stone, a plant, a metal, a star, a human body. These were not unrelated facts scattered across creation. They were variations within one living order. Different densities, different mixtures, different stages, different degrees of perfection. To the alchemist, the world was not finished in the way a carved statue is finished. It was still moving, still ripening, still working through hidden transformations. This is the idea that gave alchemy its deepest ambition. If nature is one process, then perhaps its process can be understood. If it can be understood, perhaps it can be assisted. If it can be assisted, perhaps corruption can be purified. Illness can be healed. Base metal can be perfected. And the human soul can be brought nearer to its highest condition. Notice the pattern. The alchemist's dream expands quickly. It begins with matter, but it refuses to stay there. This is why the one thing of the tablet became so fertile. It could be read as a primal substance, a cosmic principle, a divine origin, a seed of all forms, or the hidden unity beneath the opposites of nature. It did not define itself with modern precision. That vagueness would frustrate a chemist, but it energized generations of interpreters. A precise text can be useful. An ambiguous sacred text can become inexhaustible. The tablet suggests that from one thing, all things arise by adaptation or through a process of transformation. The exact wording varies across versions and translations, but the central movement remains. Unity becomes multiplicity, and multiplicity can somehow be brought back toward unity. The alchemist recognized this pattern everywhere. A plant grows from a seed, branches, flowers, fruits, decays, and returns to the earth. Water rises as vapor, gathers, falls, and rises again. Metals are hidden in ore, separated by fire, purified, alloyed, corrupted, restored. Nature seemed to separate itself in order to recombine itself. This made the alchemical laboratory feel less like an artificial intrusion and more like a collaboration. The practitioner was not merely forcing matter to behave, at least in the ideal version. The alchemist was learning nature's own habits and then imitating them with greater concentration. What nature did slowly underground, art might do more quickly in the vessel. What nature left imperfect, art might bring toward completion. There is a boldness in that idea that should not be softened too much. Alchemy was humble before ancient authority, but it was not humble before nature in the way we might expect. It believed nature had secrets, and it believed human beings could learn to participate in them. That participation could be reverent. It could also become arrogant. The line was not always clear, and alchemical literature often trembles along it. The one thing made that trembling possible. Because if everything is ultimately related, then transformation is never completely absurd. Lead becoming gold may seem impossible if metals are fixed categories. But if metals are stages within a shared metallic life, the dream becomes thinkable. Disease giving way to health may seem like ordinary medicine, but if the body participates in a cosmic balance, healing becomes part of universal restoration. The soul's purification may seem religious, but if the soul and matter mirror one another, spiritual change can be described in the language of furnaces and vessels. The one thing connects these ambitions. It also explains why alchemical texts often sound deliberately slippery. They speak of mercury, sulfur, salt, stone, water, fire, seed, womb, king, queen, dragon, bird, marriage, death, resurrection. Sometimes these words refer to substances, sometimes to stages, sometimes to principles, sometimes to more than one at once. Modern readers often get impatient with this, and fairly so. But inside the alchemical worldview, language had to stretch because the subject itself was believed to cross categories. How do you name something that is matter, spirit, process, and symbol? You use many names. Then you hide the answer among them. There is another reason for secrecy. If the one thing truly lay beneath all transformation, then it would be dangerous knowledge. Not dangerous only because it might create gold, though that possibility made rulers and patrons pay attention. Dangerous because it claimed access to the architecture of creation. To manipulate matter at that level was to approach the boundary between human craft and divine power. No wonder the tablet sounded cryptic. A plain instruction manual would have cheapened the promise. And yet, the one thing should not be dismissed as merely mystical fog. Beneath it sits an intuition that has appeared in many serious forms across intellectual history, the desire to find unity behind diversity. Philosophers looked for first principles. Physicians looked for underlying balances. Astronomers looked for order in the heavens. Modern science, in its own very different way, also searches for common laws beneath apparently separate phenomena. The alchemists were not modern scientists in disguise. We do them no favors by pretending they were. But neither were they merely irrational dreamers. They were working with a powerful question. What if the world's variety comes from transformations of something more basic? Their answers were often wrong. The question was not foolish. The Emerald Tablet survived because it placed that question in unforgettable form. All things from one thing. Multiplicity from unity. Return through transformation. It is a cosmic story in miniature, and it gave alchemists a way to see every operation as part of a larger movement. To dissolve a substance was not only to destroy it, it could be to return it toward its first condition. To separate was not only to divide, it could be to reveal hidden components. To purify was not merely to clean, it could be to remove accidental corruption and expose the inner form. To recombine was not merely to mix, it could be to create a higher unity than the one that had been broken. This is why alchemy was so fascinated by cycles. Descent and ascent, death and rebirth, separation and reunion. The one becomes many, the many return to one, and something is changed in the return. The final unity is not simply the beginning repeated. It is the beginning understood, purified, and made conscious. That is the philosophical beauty of the idea. It is also where the danger of overinterpretation enters again. When unity becomes too easy, differences are ignored. When every substance becomes a symbol of every other substance, careful observation can disappear beneath allegory. The alchemical tradition produced real techniques and real observations, but its hunger for unity sometimes swallowed distinctions that mattered. Still, the secret of one thing gave alchemy its emotional center. Without it, the furnace is just hot. The vessel is just glass. The mineral is just stubborn material refusing to behave. But with it, every change becomes a clue. Every residue, vapor, color, and crystallization may be a sentence in the long grammar of nature. The emerald tablet did not explain the one thing clearly. That was part of its power. It pointed toward unity, then stepped back, leaving generations to argue over what unity meant. A substance, a spirit, a process, a divine act, a hidden law, a seed of matter, a mirror of the soul. Perhaps the tablet endured because it never allowed one answer to close the door. It gave alchemy a secret large enough to contain both experiment and longing. That beneath the world's broken surfaces, there may be one movement, one source, one hidden life. And transformation is the art of finding the way back. The emerald tablet does not explain matter in the language of modern chemistry. It gives us a family. The sun is its father. The moon is its mother. The wind carried it in its belly. The earth is its nurse. The words are strange, almost childlike at first glance. Father, mother, wind, earth. It sounds less like a theory and more like a myth told before dawn, when the world is still simple enough to be born from relatives. But alchemical language often works this way. It takes processes too subtle to see directly and gives them bodies, parents, movements, and places of nourishment. The tablet is describing generation, not necessarily the generation of one ordinary object, but the hidden birth of matter itself, or at least the birth of the mysterious one thing through which all transformation becomes possible. Instead of giving a technical diagram, it gives an image of descent, solar force, lunar receptivity, aerial movement, earthly nourishment, fire, light, moisture, breath, body. Above, below, and the invisible passage between them. This is not a scientific account in the modern sense, and it should not be rescued by pretending it is. The tablet is not secretly describing atoms, radiation, gravity, or molecular bonding. That kind of reading usually tells us more about modern impatience than ancient wisdom. Alchemical symbols deserve to be understood in their own world, not forced to predict ours. In that world, the sun was not just a ball of light in the sky. It was a principle of heat, life, clarity, rulership, and incorruptible brilliance. The moon was not merely a pale satellite. It governed cycles, reflection, moisture, growth, fertility, and change. To say that the sun is father and the moon is mother is to imagine matter as born from the marriage of active and receptive powers. This pairing would become central to alchemical thinking. The sun and moon could represent gold and silver. They could represent masculine and feminine principles. They could represent sulfur and mercury in certain interpretive systems. They could stand for fixed and volatile, hot and cold, spirit and body, seed and womb. The symbols were elastic, and that elasticity was not accidental. It allowed the same image to guide several kinds of work at once. But elasticity is not the same as randomness. The sun-moon pairing gave alchemists a way to think about creation as balance. Matter was not born from one force alone. It required opposition, union, tension, and exchange. Too much solar force and the process burns. Too much lunar passivity, and it never takes form. The desired transformation depends on relationship. This is one of the tablet's quieter insights. Nothing becomes itself alone. Then comes the wind. The wind carried it in its belly. Here the image becomes even stranger. Wind has no womb, and yet the tablet asks us to imagine air as pregnant. Something invisible is transporting the seed of manifestation. In alchemical reading, wind could suggest spirit, breath, vapor, motion, the subtle vehicle by which power moves from one state to another. The thing being born is not yet fully earthly. It travels in a hidden, airy condition before it settles into body. Anyone who has watched a distillation can see why this mattered. A substance is heated. It releases vapor. The vapor rises, moves through the vessel, cools, condenses, and appears again as liquid. To the eye of the alchemist, this was not merely evaporation. It was matter becoming subtle, traveling invisibly, and returning changed. The wind carrying the hidden thing in its belly could be read as a symbolic version of this process. The volatile state as a womb between forms. The image is poetic, but it is not empty. It reflects attention to transformation through vapor, breath, and movement. In a pre-modern laboratory, the boundary between material and spiritual language was thin because the phenomena themselves seemed to invite it. Vapor is visible, then invisible, then visible again. It behaves like matter and like ghost. It escapes the hand, but leaves evidence. It rises like thought and returns like rain. No wonder alchemists gave it symbolic weight. Then the earth becomes nurse. This final image grounds the process. Whatever is born from sun and moon, carried by wind, must be nourished by earth. The subtle must take body. The heavenly must enter the material. The child of cosmic parents must be fed by the lowest element, not because the earth is worthless, but because nothing becomes real without embodiment. This is a deeply alchemical idea. The goal is not to flee matter. The goal is to transform it. Spirit must enter substance. Heat must work through minerals. The invisible must be captured in the visible. If the wind carries, the earth stabilizes. If the sun gives force and the moon gives form, the earth gives endurance. In the symbolic map of the tablet, matter is born through descent. But descent is not failure. That is worth pausing over, because many later spiritual traditions speak as though the material world is a trap, a prison, or a mistake. Some currents of ancient thought certainly leaned that way. But the Emerald Tablet's alchemical descendants often gave matter a more hopeful role. Matter was dark, heavy, mixed, corruptible, difficult, yes, but it was also the place where perfection could appear. The earth nourishes the mystery. It does not merely imprison it. This is one reason alchemy remained attached to physical substances even when its language became spiritual. The furnace mattered. The vessel mattered. The timing mattered. The colors mattered. The work had to happen somewhere, in something. Transformation without matter would be only an idea. The tablet's family of symbols also reveals how alchemy handled gendered imagery. Father-son and mother-moon appear again and again in later texts, sometimes joined in a sacred marriage, sometimes represented as king and queen, sometimes dying and returning in altered form. Modern readers may find the symbolism rigid, and in some ways it is. But within alchemy, Masculine and feminine symbols often served less as social commentary than as a language of polarity, active and receptive, giving and forming, fixed and flowing. Even so, symbols are never innocent. They carry the assumptions of the cultures that use them. The alchemical marriage could express balance and unity, but it could also reduce complexity into neat oppositions. This is another place where we should read carefully, neither dismissing the tradition too quickly nor allowing its symbols to become untouchable. What matters for the Emerald Tablet is that these images made transformation intelligible. The sun alone is not enough. The moon alone is not enough. The wind alone is not enough. The earth alone is not enough. Creation is a sequence of relationships. Energy must meet receptivity. Subtle movement must meet material nourishment. What begins above must pass through the middle and find a home below. Only then can the hidden thing become present. This is why alchemical diagrams later became so crowded with suns, moons, birds, dragons, kings, queens, trees, mountains, fountains, and sealed vessels. They were not decorations added after the fact. They were attempts to visualize a process believed to be too deep for plain instruction. The tablet had already taught alchemists to think in images, and images are dangerous in a very particular way. They can preserve meanings that definitions would flatten. They can hold multiple levels at once. But they can also seduce the reader into thinking they understand because they feel something. A beautiful symbol can create the sensation of insight before insight has actually arrived. Alchemy's symbolic language is powerful for exactly this reason. It can open the mind, and it can mislead it. The Emerald Tablet survives on that edge. Its sun and moon, wind and earth are not a recipe we can follow in any simple modern sense. But they are a coded map of generation, one that helped alchemists imagine matter as alive with ancestry, motion, and destiny. Matter was not dead weight. It was born. It was carried. It was nourished. It had a story before it had a shape. And perhaps that is why these lines remained so memorable. They made the universe feel intimate, not smaller, but closer. The forces of heaven were no longer distant abstractions. They became parents. The invisible motion between realms became a bearer of life. The earth beneath the feet became a nurse of mysteries. In a few compressed images, the tablet turned cosmology into genealogy. It told alchemists that every substance had a hidden lineage, and that to transform matter, one had to understand not only what it was, but how it had been born. The easiest way to make alchemy look foolish is to describe it as a long, greedy failure. Men in smoky rooms, strange vessels, secret books, a desperate obsession with turning lead into gold. The punchline writes itself. Centuries of confusion before modern chemistry finally arrived, opened a window, and cleared the air. There is truth in that picture, but not enough. Gold mattered. It mattered economically, politically, symbolically, and spiritually. No honest account of alchemy should pretend otherwise. Patrons wanted results. Rulers wanted revenue. Fraudsters learned to imitate mystery because mystery could be profitable. The promise of artificial gold attracted ambition in the same way every age attracts people hoping for impossible returns on a private investment. Human nature did not begin with the stock market, but alchemy was never only about gold. In many of its most serious forms, alchemy was a discipline of transformation. It asked what matter could become under pressure: heat, purification, separation, decay, and recombination. It studied how substances changed, how metals behaved, how vapors rose and condensed, how oils, salts, minerals, and plant materials could be prepared. It was concerned with medicines, tinctures, distillation, dyes, corrosion, preservation, and the strange fact that nature seemed to hide new forms inside old ones. Gold was the most famous symbol of that dream because gold seemed incorruptible. It resisted tarnish. It shone with a steady solar authority. It looked like matter that had reached a kind of perfection. So the desire to make gold was not always a crude hunger for wealth. Sometimes it was the desire to understand perfection in material form. That distinction matters. A coin is valuable because a society agrees to value it. Alchemical gold was valuable because it seemed to reveal what nature wanted to become. This is why the emerald tablet could be so influential without offering anything like a practical recipe for making money. It spoke in principles: unity, correspondence, ascent, descent, generation, transformation. Its authority lay in suggesting that all changes in matter belong to one deeper operation. The alchemist did not merely want to force lead into a more expensive costume. In the ideal imagination, the alchemist wanted to cooperate with nature's hidden movement toward completion. Of course, the ideal and the reality did not always shake hands. There were sincere investigators, and there were frauds. There were careful observers, and there were dreamers who mistook metaphor for method. There were people who spent years refining techniques, and others who wrapped ignorance in obscure language. Alchemy was not one thing. It was a field of aspiration, error, craft, symbolism, and experiment. And its borders were never as clean as later histories sometimes prefer. That messiness is part of its importance. Before chemistry became a modern science with standardized language and controlled methods, people still had to work with substances. They had to make pigments and medicines, refine metals, prepare glass, extract essences, preserve materials, ferment liquids, and treat disease. They learned by doing, by repeating, by failing, by noticing that one vessel behaved differently from another, that heat applied too quickly could ruin a preparation, that a sealed container could produce unexpected results, that color changes mattered even when their causes were misunderstood. Alchemy gathered many of these practices beneath a larger philosophy. Sometimes that philosophy clarified the work. Sometimes it obscured it, but it gave practitioners a reason to look closely. And close attention, even when guided by imperfect theory, can still discover things. The alchemical furnace was a place of patience. Matter does not always reveal itself quickly. A substance might need to be heated gently, then strongly, then cooled, dissolved, filtered, sealed, dried, ground, and returned to the fire. Days might pass, weeks, longer, colors appeared and vanished, vapors condensed on glass, residues formed at the bottom of vessels. What looked dead could become active. What looked solid could melt, smoke, vanish, and reappear. To someone trained to see transformation everywhere, these changes were not minor technical details. They were messages. This is where alchemy becomes difficult to classify. It was practical enough to matter to the history of science, but symbolic enough to resist being called science in the modern sense. It worked with real substances, but explained them through a universe alive with correspondences. It produced techniques that later chemistry could inherit. but it wrapped those techniques in metaphors of kings, queens, dragons, marriages, deaths, and rebirths. Modern readers often want to separate the useful from the strange, keep the distillation, discard the dragon. That is understandable, but historically too neat. For many alchemists, the technique and the symbol were not separate compartments. The dragon might refer to a volatile substance, a dangerous stage, a dissolving force, a spiritual trial, or several of these at once. The symbol helped organize attention, memory, and secrecy. It could mislead, but it could also preserve practical knowledge in a coded form. Alchemy's concern with medicine is especially important. The transformation of metals was only one expression of a wider hope, that corrupted or imbalanced matter could be restored. The sick body, like the impure metal, seemed to need purification, correction, strengthening. Medicines were not simply aids to comfort. They could be imagined as agents of renewal. The dream of a universal medicine, sometimes linked to the same perfected substance as the philosopher's stone, shows how closely healing and metallurgy could be joined in alchemical thought. To perfect metal, to heal the body, to purify the soul. These were different ambitions, but they shared one grammar. Something mixed, darkened, unstable, or corrupt could undergo a process and emerge clarified. The process might involve fire, water, time, enclosure, dissolution, or reunion. This is why alchemical imagery often feels psychological even when it is discussing matter. The tradition gave physical change an inward echo, but we should be careful not to turn every alchemist into a therapist with a furnace. That is a modern temptation. Many were deeply interested in substances themselves. They wanted results, not just metaphors. Their work had smells, stains, burns, expenses, failures, and occasional successes. It involved hands as much as imagination. The real fascination lies in the fact that alchemy did not see a contradiction between the two. Matter could be handled and contemplated. A vessel could be equipment and symbol. Fire could heat a substance and represent purification. Gold could be wealth and perfection. This is what the phrase alchemy before gold really means. Not alchemy without gold, but alchemy before gold becomes the whole story. Before the cartoon takes over. Before the laboratory is reduced to greed. Before we forget that the alchemist's deepest subject was change itself. The emerald tablet helped preserve that larger vision. Its famous lines did not say, "Make gold and become rich," and they described a cosmos in motion. One thing becoming many, upper and lower mirroring each other, subtle force descending into earth, power gathered through circulation. This language allowed alchemy to imagine every operation as part of a universal process. That imagination could lead to error. It could also lead to endurance, because gold alone would not have sustained alchemy for so long. If the only goal had been wealth, repeated failure would have destroyed the tradition more quickly. What kept it alive was the belief that each failed experiment might still reveal a fragment of nature's hidden behavior, that each symbol might conceal a method, that each transformation in the vessel might correspond to a transformation in the world or in the worker. Alchemy promised that matter was not finished speaking, and for centuries, people listened. They listened through smoke, through manuscripts, through coded diagrams and ruined experiments, through disappointment and hope. Some heard only what they wanted to hear. Some heard enough to refine real techniques. Some mistook secrecy for wisdom, Some turned careful observation into a path that would eventually help feed the growth of chemistry. The story is not clean. It is more interesting because it is not clean. Alchemy was a bridge built from both insight and illusion. On one side stood sacred cosmology, ancient authority, and the dream of perfection. On the other side stood furnaces, vessels, minerals, medicines, and the stubborn behavior of matter. The bridge did not always hold, but enough people crossed it that the history of science, medicine, and esoteric thought would all be changed by the traffic. Gold glittered at the far end, but transformation was the road. The emerald tablet did not pass through the Arabic-speaking world like a sealed relic carried carefully from one shelf to another. It entered a furnace, not only the literal furnace of alchemical work, though that mattered. It entered a furnace of languages, arguments, commentaries, translations, medical traditions, philosophical questions, religious boundaries, and practical experiments. Inside that heat, older materials did not simply survive. They changed. This is one of the details that often gets lost when people tell the history too quickly. The Arabic-speaking intellectual world is sometimes treated as a corridor between antiquity and Europe, as though its scholars merely held Greek wisdom for a while and then handed it westward. That is far too thin a picture. A corridor does not interpret. A corridor does not invent vocabulary. A corridor does not test substances, reorganize theories, or produce new forms of technical writing. The world that preserved the Emerald Tablet was not a corridor. It was a workshop. Greek philosophy entered this workshop. So did medical learning, mathematical methods, astrological systems, older legends of Egypt, and traditions associated with Hermes. But once inside, these inheritances were not left untouched. They were translated into Arabic, and translation is never just moving words from one box into another. Translation is decision. It forces a reader to ask what a term means, what it resembles, what it cannot carry, and what must be built around it so the idea can breathe in a new language. Alchemy needed that labor. Its language was already difficult in Greek and late antique settings. It dealt in substances, qualities, processes, symbols, and metaphysical claims. To bring such material into Arabic required more than literacy. It required conceptual engineering. Writers had to speak about metals, spirits, bodies, vapors, essences, balances, mixtures, transformations, and hidden principles in ways that could be copied, debated, and used. A new alchemical language began to form, and with language came ambition. The Arabic alchemical tradition did not merely ask whether one metal could be changed into another. It asked how nature generates substances. It asked whether metals grow underground. It asked what role heat, moisture, time, and planetary influence might play in their formation. It asked whether human art could imitate nature, accelerate nature, or even correct nature. It asked whether the same principles that governed minerals could help explain medicine, the body, and spiritual refinement. In such a setting, the Emerald Tablet was almost perfectly suited for survival. It was short enough to quote, old enough in reputation to command respect, obscure enough to invite commentary, and broad enough to be useful in more than one argument. A practical recipe can become obsolete when it fails. A symbolic principle can be reinterpreted when circumstances change. The tablet's strength was that it rarely pinned itself down. It did not demand one furnace design, one substance, one technique, one school. It offered a grammar of transformation. Arabic alchemical writers and readers could place that grammar beside their own theories and make it speak. The result was not uniform. Some strands of alchemical writing leaned toward laboratory process. Others leaned toward cosmology. Some were medical in concern. Some were wrapped in hermetic authority. Some preserved older materials in fragments whose origins are difficult to untangle. Some were probably more speculative than practical. As always with alchemy, the tradition resists clean sorting. But the diversity itself is revealing. It shows that alchemy was not just a trick for making gold. It was a way of thinking across boundaries. The physician could care about purification because the body decays. The metallurgist could care because ores resist perfection. The philosopher could care because generation and corruption were central problems in the natural world. The astrologer could care because celestial order seemed to govern earthly change. The spiritual writer could care because the soul, too, could be imagined as mixed, darkened, refined, and restored. The tablet sat at the center of that pattern like a small, hard knot. Its language of above and below gave cosmic dignity to material operations. Its claim of one thing gave unity to a field otherwise full of scattered practices. Its images of sun, moon, wind, and earth allowed readers to move between laboratory observation and symbolic interpretation without feeling they had changed subjects. That ability to move between levels is one reason Arabic alchemy became so productive. It did not always separate the practical from the philosophical. A substance in the vessel might be treated as evidence for a theory of matter. A theory of matter might guide the preparation of substances. A medical concern might borrow an alchemical process. A symbolic passage might preserve a technical hint. The entire field worked through circulation, not unlike the tablet's own movement of ascent, descent, and return. There is a temptation to look back from modern chemistry and ask only, what did they get right? That is a useful question, but not the only one. A better historical question is, what kinds of attention did this tradition make possible? It made people attend to heat, to duration, to sequence, to vessels, to color, to smell, to texture, to what evaporates and what remains, to what dissolves and what refuses, to the fact that matter changes differently when enclosed than when exposed, to the possibility that the visible result of an operation may not reveal the whole process that produced it. Even where theory was mistaken, attention could be disciplined. This is the quiet gift hidden inside much alchemical work. The symbols may be strange. The cosmology may be outdated. The goals may sometimes be impossible. But the habit of watching matter under controlled conditions mattered. The furnace did not care about the writer's metaphors. It answered in residues, vapors, cracks, stains, and failures. Alchemists could misread those answers, but they had to notice them first. Arabic intellectual culture also gave alchemy something else. Commentary. Commentary is easy to underestimate. It can look secondary, as though the real work belongs only to the original text. But for a cryptic text like the Emerald Tablet, commentary is life support. Without interpreters, the tablet is a riddle. With interpreters, it becomes a tradition. Each explanation adds a layer. Each layer changes the way the next reader approaches the text. A phrase that once seemed cosmological can become operational. A phrase that once seemed chemical can become spiritual. A symbol can harden into doctrine, then soften again under a new reading. This is how a short text grows without adding many words of its own. It becomes surrounded by thought. The Arabic furnace of knowledge did exactly that. It surrounded the tablet with thought, and in doing so, made it portable. By the time the text moved toward Latin Europe, it was not merely a few mysterious sentences. It was part of a larger Hermetic and alchemical inheritance, carrying the prestige of ancient Egypt, the authority of Hermes, and the intellectual labor of Arabic-speaking scholars and practitioners. Europe would often receive it as a message from antiquity, but that message had already been shaped by centuries of translation and interpretation. This is not a footnote to the story. It is one of the story's central transformations. The Emerald Tablet became powerful not because it remained unchanged in some pure original form, hidden from history. It became powerful because history kept working on it. The tablet's voice was ancient in reputation, but medieval in its traceable life. Hermetic in authority, but Arabic in its earliest recoverable written pathway. Universal in its claims, but dependent on very particular cultures of reading. That contradiction should not weaken the mystery. It should make it sharper. The tablet promises one hidden operation behind all transformations. Its own history becomes an example of that promise. A text moves from legend into manuscript, from one language into another, from one religious and intellectual world into another, and each passage alters it without destroying it. It is separated, purified, recombined, and sent onward. The alchemists might have recognized the pattern. A thing enters the fire. It does not come out the same. The Emerald Tablet did not enter Europe like a trumpet blast. It arrived more quietly than that. Not as a public revelation, not as a stone lifted before a crowd, not as a single dramatic announcement that the wisdom of Hermes had crossed into Latin Christendom. It came by the slower, more fragile road of manuscripts, copied texts, translated treatises, marginal notes, uncertain attributions, and scholars trying to make sense of materials that had already lived several lives before reaching them. This is how many powerful ideas travel, not in their purest form, but in bundles. A translator does not receive only a text. He receives its aura, its supposed author, its earlier interpretations, its technical vocabulary, its obscurities, and sometimes its mistakes. By the time Hermetic and alchemical writings moved into Latin Europe, they carried the prestige of ancient wisdom and the marks of Arabic intellectual labor. Europe often looked at these works and saw Egypt, but between Europe and Egypt stood translation, commentary, adaptation, and time. That is not a small detail. It means the Emerald Tablet reached European readers already layered. A Latin scholar encountering the tablet might have believed he was reading the distilled speech of Hermes Trismegistus, the ancient master whose authority seemed to reach back before ordinary philosophy. But what sat before him was also a product of medieval transmission. Words had passed through Arabic. Concepts had been shaped by Islamic intellectual culture. Alchemical vocabulary had been refined in contexts far removed from the imagined chamber beneath the statue. The text was ancient in reputation, but medieval in its path. This made it especially potent. Europe in the medieval period was hungry for certain kinds of knowledge, not indiscriminately and not without suspicion, but there was a strong appetite for works that promised access to Aristotle, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, astrology, and the hidden operations of nature. Translation networks helped bring Arabic and Greek learning into Latin. Scholars, physicians, clerics, and practitioners encountered materials that expanded the intellectual map of the world they knew. Alchemy traveled within that movement. It did not always travel comfortably. Christian Europe had its own anxieties about magic, fraud, secrecy, and forbidden knowledge. A text promising power over matter could be fascinating, but also morally dangerous. If a process claimed to perfect metals, heal corruption, or reveal the unity of creation, the question was not only whether it worked. The question was whether such knowledge was legitimate for human beings to pursue. That tension followed the Emerald Tablet. Its language was reverent enough to sound philosophical, obscure enough to feel initiatory, and powerful enough to raise suspicion. It did not openly defy religious boundaries. It spoke instead of creation, unity, ascent, descent, and the marvels of one thing. This gave readers room to interpret it as natural philosophy rather than sorcery, as wisdom rather than rebellion. But the line could be thin, and alchemy often lived along thin lines. The manuscript road also changed the reading experience. A printed book, when widely available, can create a public conversation. Manuscripts create smaller circles. A text copied by hand does not belong to everyone at once. It belongs to whoever can access it, read it, afford it, protect it, or persuade someone to share it. Its obscurity is not only intellectual, it is social. Knowledge moves through trust, patronage, libraries, monasteries, courts, workshops, and private collections. This helped alchemy preserve its atmosphere of secrecy. Not every secret was deliberately hidden. Some knowledge was simply difficult to obtain. Some was locked behind language. Some required technical background. Some was made obscure by bad copying, cramped handwriting, damaged sources, or uncertain translation. But the effect could be the same. The reader felt he was approaching something reserved for the few, and the Emerald Tablet benefited from that feeling. A short text in a manuscript can have an odd power. It may appear after a larger treatise, before a commentary, embedded in a collection, or introduced under a famous name. Its very brevity can make it seem like the center of the page, as if everything around it is trying to explain what it refuses to say plainly. A long book argues, the tablet declares. This is one reason it could become a touchstone for European alchemists. It offered a compact authority at a time when alchemy needed justification. The practice was expensive, uncertain, and easily mocked. Furnaces consumed fuel. Materials cost money. Results failed. Patrons grew impatient. Religious critics worried. Rival practitioners accused one another of ignorance or deceit. In such a world, a hermetic text with ancient authority could give the work dignity. The alchemist was not merely tinkering in smoke. He was participating in a wisdom older than the present age. But the European reception of the tablet also shows how easily authority can travel faster than understanding. To read the tablet was not necessarily to grasp it. Its phrases resisted simple explanation. That which is above is like that which is below. All things were from one. Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross. These ideas could inspire careful interpretation, but they could also be stretched to cover almost any theory. A vague authority is very useful if a reader already knows what he wants to find. This is not unique to alchemy. It is one of the recurring habits of intellectual history. Difficult old texts are often treated as mirrors. Each age peers into them and discovers, with suspicious convenience, that the ancient master anticipated its own concerns. The medieval alchemist saw processes of matter. The spiritual interpreter saw the soul. The natural philosopher saw a universal principle. The occultist saw hidden forces. The skeptical modern reader may see only ambiguity. The tablet allowed all of them to look. That flexibility made it durable, but also unstable. A text that can mean many things risks meaning whatever the reader desires. Yet if it meant only one narrow thing, it might not have survived so long. The Emerald Tablet's European life depended on this balance, clear enough to suggest a doctrine, obscure enough to generate a tradition. Translation intensified the problem. Some words do not move cleanly from one language to another. Technical terms shift. Metaphors lose their original associations. A phrase that once carried a specific nuance may become broader, stranger, or more solemn in Latin. Translators had to choose, and their choices became the foundation for later interpretation. A small decision could redirect centuries of commentary. This is why the manuscript road is not merely a delivery route. It is a transformation process. Just as alchemists believed matter could be altered by circulation, heating, separation, and recombination, texts are altered by copying, translating, excerpting, and explaining. The Emerald Tablet that entered Europe was not separate from its movement. Its authority was made stronger by the distance it had traveled, but its meaning was also made harder to recover. And perhaps that difficulty was part of the appeal. A text too easy to understand rarely feels like the key to the cosmos. European scholars and practitioners received the tablet not as a finished answer, but as a challenge. It asked to be decoded. It invited diagrams, glosses, analogies, and experiments. It seemed to say that the universe had a hidden structure, and that structure could be compressed into language, but only language dense enough to keep the unprepared outside. This is how the tablet became guarded even when it was copied. Its secrecy was not only in who possessed it. Its secrecy was in the reading. A person could have the words and still not have the secret. That distinction mattered deeply to alchemy. The true art was never supposed to be available merely through possession. One needed judgment, discipline, purification, perhaps divine permission, perhaps initiation, perhaps simply long experience with the stubbornness of matter. The manuscript road into Europe, then, was not the end of the tablet's journey. It was a new enclosure. The text had left the Arabic furnace and entered Latin libraries, but it remained sealed in another way. Sealed by translation, by symbolism, by reverence, and by the difficulty of turning cryptic wisdom into actual practice. It arrived quietly. But once it arrived, it began to work on Europe from the margins inward. A few lines copied by hand. A name older than proof. A promise that nature could be read, if one learned how to read beneath the surface. The tablet had crossed another threshold, and like everything alchemy touched, it came through changed. The Emerald Tablet became most famous through its connection to one of the most persistent dreams in the history of hidden knowledge, the Philosopher's Stone. The name can be misleading. It sounds like an object small enough to hold. Perhaps a red stone, a powder, a jewel-like substance, something concealed in a box and revealed only to the worthy. Alchemical texts often encouraged that image. They speak as though the stone is a thing, a substance, a final product, the treasure at the end of the work. But the philosopher's stone was never only a stone. It was a machine of meaning. For alchemists, the stone could be imagined as the perfected substance capable of perfecting other substances. It might transform base metals into gold. It might heal disease. It might extend life. It might restore corruption to wholeness. These promises are extravagant, and they should not be accepted as historical achievements. But they are valuable because they reveal what the alchemist believed transformation was for. The stone was not merely wealth concentrated into matter, it was correction. Nature, in the alchemical imagination, was unfinished or obstructed. Metals grew slowly in the earth, moving toward perfection over vast periods of time. Disease showed matter in disorder. The human soul suffered its own mixture of darkness, confusion, desire, and decay. The philosopher's stone promised an answer to all of this, a perfected agent that could bring other things toward their proper completion. That is why the stone sits so naturally beside the emerald tablet. The tablet speaks of one thing, of above and below, of subtle and gross, of ascent and descent. The stone became the imagined result of understanding those movements. It was the one thing made operative, the hidden unity of nature, not merely contemplated, but embodied in a substance powerful enough to act. This is the important shift. A principle becomes a product. A cosmic pattern becomes a material goal. A sentence becomes a furnace process. And yet, even here, alchemy refuses to stay in one category. The stone was material, but also metaphorical. It belonged to the laboratory and to the soul. The work of making it could be described as a series of operations on matter: calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, coagulation. But the same operations could also describe an inward discipline. The old self must be broken down. The confused mind must be clarified. The scattered parts must be reunited in a higher form. This is why some alchemical writing sounds like chemistry having a dream about salvation. A metal is purified, and somehow the human being is implicated. A substance blackens in the vessel, and the reader senses a moral darkness. A red stage appears, and it suggests completion, life, or royal power. The stone at the end is not just something made, it is something earned through transformation. We should be cautious, though, about making the spiritual reading too neat. Not every alchemist was secretly writing psychology. Not every furnace was a symbol for meditation. Many practitioners wanted material results. They sought medicines, metallic transmutation, practical secrets, and patronage. Some believed the spiritual and material were inseparable. Others may have cared far more about one than the other. The tradition is too varied to be reduced to a single hidden meaning. Still, the philosopher's stone became powerful precisely because it could hold both meanings at once. As a material dream, it promised control over corruption. As a spiritual image, it promised the perfection of the person. That dual promise made it almost impossible to exhaust. The emerald tablet gave alchemists a language for the stone's possibility. If all things come from one thing, then perhaps there is one substance from which transformation can be directed. If above and below correspond, then perhaps a material operation can reflect and participate in a cosmic one. If the subtle must be separated from the gross, then perhaps the alchemist's work is to extract the pure force hidden inside heavy matter. If the work ascends from earth to heaven and descends again to earth, then perhaps the perfected substance must pass through spiritualization and return with power. The stone becomes the tablet made dense, a small body containing a vast law. This is why alchemical texts often speak of it with a strange mixture of confidence and concealment. The authors insist the secret is simple, even obvious, and then bury it beneath riddles. They say the material is common, yet impossible to recognize. They say the work follows nature, yet requires extraordinary skill. They say the stone is one, but describe many ingredients. They say the truth is everywhere, but only the wise can see it. To a modern reader, this can feel evasive. Sometimes it probably was. Alchemy produced fraud, exaggeration, and deliberate obscurity. A writer who never gave clear instructions could always claim the reader had failed, not the teaching. A failed experiment could be blamed on impurity, timing, unworthiness, or a misunderstood symbol. This made alchemy resilient, but also vulnerable to deception. Yet the secrecy also had a deeper function. It protected the idea that transformation could not be separated from preparation. The stone was not supposed to be obtained by mere curiosity. The reader had to be changed enough to understand what was being described. Whether or not one accepts that premise, it explains the tone. The secret is hidden not only in the text, but in the reader's capacity to read. This is why the philosopher's stone works so well as a spiritual machine. A normal machine does work on the world. This symbolic machine does work on the seeker. It reorganizes desire. At first, perhaps, the seeker wants gold. Then the texts insist that gold is only the outer sign of a deeper perfection. The seeker wants a substance. The tradition answers with a process. The seeker wants power over nature. The work demands obedience to nature. The seeker wants the final stone. The path repeatedly dissolves whatever feels final. In the best alchemical imagination, the stone corrects the seeker's question. What do you really want transformed? The metal? The body? The soul? The world? Alchemy's answer was often all of them, because it did not believe these domains were fully separate. The same corruption appeared in different registers. The same cure might appear under different names. This made the philosopher's stone absurdly ambitious, but also profoundly coherent within the Hermetic worldview. The stone healed because nature was one. It transmuted because metals were related. It enlightened because matter and spirit mirrored each other. It endured because human beings fear decay and long for completion. That last point may be the most important. The philosopher's stone survived as an idea because it spoke to ordinary human terror in extraordinary language. Everything rots. Bodies fail. Metals corrode. Wealth disappears. Empires break. Memory fades. The stone promised that corruption was not the final law. Somewhere inside nature, there might be a principle of restoration. This was not only greed. It was grief seeking technology. The Emerald Tablet gave that grief a cosmic grammar. It suggested that the power of the whole universe could be gathered through right understanding, that what descends into matter can rise again, and that what rises can return with greater force. The philosopher's stone became the imagined tool of that return, a perfected substance, a medicine for metals, a medicine for bodies, a mirror for the perfected soul. Whether it ever existed, as alchemists claimed, is not the real question for us. The evidence does not support the literal fulfillment of its grandest promises, but the stone's historical reality lies elsewhere. In the laboratories it funded, the manuscripts it inspired, the techniques it helped preserve, and the symbolic pressure it placed on the human imagination. The philosopher's stone was the goal no one could reliably produce, but as an idea, it produced centuries of work. By the time Hermes Trismegistus entered the imagination of the Renaissance, he was no longer merely an old name attached to difficult texts. He had become an ancestor. Renaissance Europe was fascinated by beginnings. Scholars looked back toward Greece and Rome, but many also looked beyond them, searching for wisdom older than Plato, older than Aristotle, older than the familiar authorities of classical learning. The past was not simply a field of study, it was a ladder. The older a teaching appeared to be, the closer it seemed to stand to the first light of truth. Hermes was perfect for this hunger. He seemed ancient without being fully reachable, Egyptian without being fully Egyptian, philosophical, priestly, magical, and scientific all at once. He could be imagined as a sage who knew the unity of creation before later ages divided knowledge into competing schools. For thinkers drawn to natural magic, astrology, medicine, theology, and philosophy, Hermes offered a thrilling possibility: that beneath the fragments of inherited learning, there had once been a single sacred science. This was not a small claim. If Hermes was older than the Greek philosophers, then Hermetic writings could be treated not as late compilations or obscure curiosities, but as primordial wisdom. They could appear to confirm that the deepest truths of nature and divinity had been known in remote antiquity, then hidden, scattered, and recovered only by the learned few. The emerald tablet gained enormous authority from that atmosphere. Its brevity now worked in its favor even more strongly. Renaissance readers loved emblems, aphorisms, diagrams, and compressed symbols that seemed to contain more than they said. A short text attributed to Hermes could feel like a seed of total knowledge. It did not need to explain everything. Its difficulty was part of its prestige. To understand the Renaissance reawakening of Hermes, we have to resist a modern caricature. It was not simply a period where people threw away reason and embraced magic. The more interesting truth is that many Renaissance thinkers did not see natural magic, medicine, mathematics, astrology, and philosophy as enemies. They often saw them as neighboring paths toward the hidden structure of creation. The world was God's work, nature was full of signs, and the human mind, properly disciplined, might learn to read those signs. Natural magic, in this context, did not always mean stage sorcery or demon worship. At its more respectable edge, it meant the study of hidden properties in nature: sympathies, antipathies, influences, correspondences, and powers not immediately obvious to the senses. A magnet attracting iron was wondrous. Certain plants affecting the body was wondrous. The timing of celestial movements seemed wondrous. The boundary between marvel and mechanism had not yet hardened. Hermetic thought gave that wonder a genealogy. The emerald tablet gave it a formula. As above, so below could be read as the foundation of cosmic correspondence. The one thing could be read as the unity behind natural diversity. The ascent from earth to heaven and descent again could be read as the circulation of spirit through matter. For a Renaissance mind already trained to see hidden links between the human body, the planets, music, mathematics, metals, and divine order, the tablet seemed less like an oddity than a confirmation. It said, in a few lines, What an entire worldview hoped was true, that the universe was not mute, that nature's secrets could be approached, that the human being stood between the earthly and the celestial, capable of understanding both. This made the tablet central not only to alchemy, but to the broader occult philosophy of the age. Occult here simply means hidden, not automatically evil, not automatically irrational. Hidden. The occult philosopher wanted to know the concealed forces by which nature operated. The alchemist wanted to know how those forces appeared in matter and how they might be guided. The physician wanted to know how hidden causes produced health or illness. The astrologer wanted to know how celestial order affected earthly life. Hermes seemed to stand above all these inquiries like an ancient sponsor. But the Renaissance also sharpened a danger already present in the tradition, the danger of authority borrowed from imagined antiquity. A text believed to be extremely old can become difficult to question. If Hermes spoke before Plato, perhaps Plato learned from Hermes. If Hermes came from Egypt, perhaps Greek wisdom itself was only a later echo. If the tablet was Hermetic, perhaps its obscurities were not weaknesses, but signs of a deeper science. The prestige of antiquity could turn uncertainty into reverence. This does not mean Renaissance readers were foolish. Many were brilliant, careful, and deeply learned, but they often operated with historical assumptions that later scholarship would challenge. The dating of Hermetic writings, the identity of Hermes, and the actual pathways by which these texts formed were far more complicated than the Renaissance myth of primeval authorship allowed. Still, myths can be intellectually productive even when they are historically wrong. The belief in Hermes helped create a culture of inquiry, where ancient texts, material experiment, symbolic interpretation, and philosophical speculation could meet. It encouraged readers to take alchemy seriously as part of a grand wisdom tradition. It gave natural magic a dignified ancestry. It made the investigation of hidden properties feel not like superstition, but like recovery. Recovery again. The same emotional pattern returns. The hidden chamber beneath the statue. The manuscript road. The ancient voice. The lost science. Renaissance Hermeticism was built on the feeling that truth had once been whole and could be made whole again. That feeling shaped the way people read the Emerald Tablet. They did not approach it as a minor medieval alchemical passage. They approached it as a fragment of the first philosophy, a message from the dawn of knowledge, a set of instructions whose full meaning might unlock not just metallic transmutation, but the architecture of nature itself. This is why the tablet could sit so comfortably beside Renaissance dreams of universal knowledge. The age produced encyclopedic ambitions, elaborate correspondences, memory systems, cosmic diagrams, and attempts to reconcile ancient authorities with Christian theology and emerging observations of nature. The tablet's language was broad enough to serve them all. It was a small text with a large appetite around it. And yet, something begins to shift here. The very intensity of Renaissance Hermeticism helped prepare the conditions for its later unraveling. When scholars love antiquity, they also learn to compare manuscripts. When they compare manuscripts, they notice differences. When they notice differences, they begin asking harder questions about origin, transmission, and date. The reverence for ancient wisdom helped develop tools that could eventually challenge the age of Hermes himself. This is one of history's quiet ironies. The Renaissance raised Hermes high. Then the methods sharpened in the study of old texts helped bring him back down to earth. But before that happened, His reawakening changed the fate of the Emerald Tablet. It made the tablet more than an alchemical curiosity. It turned it into a symbol of lost total knowledge at a moment when Europe was reimagining what knowledge could be. The laboratory, the library, the observatory, and the study were not yet strangers to one another. A single learned person might move among them, hoping that the world's scattered signs could still be gathered into one intelligible pattern. The Emerald Tablet whispered exactly that hope. Not loudly, not clearly, but with enough ancient gravity that readers leaned closer. Hermes, the composite sage, became a Renaissance authority because he offered what the age desired most, a past deep enough to authorize the future. Through him, alchemy could look less like a marginal craft and more like the practical branch of primordial wisdom. Through him, natural magic could claim ancestry. Through him, the tablet could speak with a voice older than the manuscripts that carried it. And for a while, many believed it. They believed that Egypt had spoken through Hermes, that Hermes had spoken through the tablet, and that the tablet, if properly understood, might teach human beings how to read the living book of nature. At some point, the story of alchemy begins to change its lighting. The symbols do not disappear. The dragons, kings, moons, suns, marriages, deaths, and rebirths remain scattered through manuscripts like signs from a dream no one is ready to wake from. But another kind of attention grows stronger. The attention of the hand, the eye, the vessel, the flame. Alchemy had always worked with matter. Yet over time, its practical side became harder to ignore. Furnaces had to be built. Glassware had to survive heat. Substances had to be weighed, ground, dissolved, distilled, sealed, and stored. A theory could be magnificent, but if the vessel cracked, the work failed. A metaphor could be beautiful, but if the fire was too violent, the material burned. The laboratory had a way of humiliating language. This is one of the reasons alchemy matters to the history of science. Not because it was secretly modern chemistry in disguise. It was not. Its theories of matter were often wrong, and its symbolic explanations could drift far beyond what experiment justified. But alchemy helped cultivate habits, tools, and procedures that later scientific practice could inherit. Repeated operations, controlled heating, distillation, extraction, sublimation, crystallization, filtration, and close observation of material change. The transition was not a clean revolution. There was no single morning when mystical alchemy ended and chemistry began. No dramatic moment when every furnace was relabeled and every dragon erased from the notebooks. For a long time, the symbolic and the experimental lived side by side. A practitioner might use careful apparatus while still interpreting the result through hermetic correspondences. A recipe might preserve useful technical steps while explaining them with spiritual language. A laboratory could be both a workplace and a theater of cosmic transformation. This overlap can feel frustrating now because we like tidy categories. We prefer to say, this part was science, that part was superstition. This instrument was useful, that symbol was decorative. But history rarely sorts itself so politely. Many of the people whose work helped move knowledge forward did not think in the categories we use to praise or dismiss them. They followed problems. How do you separate a volatile substance from a fixed one? How do you draw an essence from a plant? How do you purify a metal? How do you preserve a preparation? How do you make heat steady? How do you recognize when a process has reached the right stage? These questions are practical. They require technique, not just belief. And each answer leaves traces: better furnaces, clearer instructions, more specialized vessels, more disciplined observation. The alchemist might still say that the subtle must be separated from the gross because the emerald tablet said so. But in practice, separation meant work. Heating, vaporizing, condensing, filtering, decanting, repeating. The phrase became an operation. That is where the tablet's influence becomes quietly interesting. Its language was not technical, yet it encouraged a technical imagination. Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity. However differently readers translated or interpreted that idea, it dignified the act of separation. It made the laboratory process feel like a cosmic necessity. To divide, purify, and recombine was not merely craft. It was participation in the structure of nature. This helped alchemy endure during a period when practical results mattered increasingly. Medicine, mining, metallurgy, glassmaking, dyeing, and pharmacy all demanded material knowledge. Alchemical practitioners, whatever their grand theories, often moved near these worlds. They knew that substances could not be bullied by imagination alone. A mineral either yielded something under treatment or it did not. A distillation either produced a useful fraction or it failed. A medicine either helped, harmed, or did nothing obvious enough to preserve confidence. The world pushed back. That pushback was important. A purely symbolic system can explain away anything. A laboratory system cannot do that forever. Repeated failure forces adjustment. Not always immediately, not always honestly. But over generations, practice begins to discipline speculation. Recipes become more precise. Apparatus improves. Some claims are quietly abandoned. Others are tested under new conditions. Techniques detach from the symbolic systems that once housed them. This is not the death of alchemy so much as its slow decomposition. And decomposition, appropriately enough, is an alchemical image. Parts separate. Some decay. Some remain useful. Some recombine into something new. From alchemy, later chemistry inherited not a finished science, but a material culture. Tools, procedures, vocabularies, and the conviction that substances could be systematically transformed. It also inherited problems. How should matter be classified? What is a pure substance? What happens in combustion? What makes acids active? How do gases behave? These questions would eventually require explanations far beyond the Hermetic framework. But the early laboratory did not emerge from emptiness. It emerged from people already heating, mixing, observing, distilling, and arguing about matter. The spiritual language did not simply block inquiry. Sometimes it motivated it. If matter concealed divine order, then matter deserved attention. If the lower mirrored the higher, then the humble residue at the bottom of a vessel might not be worthless. If nature could be perfected, then the imperfect material in front of the practitioner might be a path rather than a dead end. This is one of alchemy's paradoxes. Its symbolic worldview could mislead the mind, but it could also keep the eye fixed on change. And change is the laboratory's native language. When alchemy entered the laboratory more fully, it did not become less mysterious at once. It became mysterious in a different way. The mystery shifted from ancient authority to reproducible behavior. Why does this vapor condense here and not there? Why does this substance change color at this stage? Why does one preparation fail when another succeeds? The old answer might invoke celestial sympathy or hidden qualities. The emerging answer would demand clearer causes. The gap between those answers widened slowly. Inside that widening gap, chemistry began to form. Yet it would be unfair to imagine chemistry as the sensible child escaping an embarrassing parent. The relationship is more intimate and more awkward. Alchemy gave chemistry equipment, practices, questions, and obsessions. Chemistry gave matter a new language, one that gradually no longer needed Hermes to authorize it. That was a profound change. Once matter could be explained through measurable interactions rather than hidden correspondences, the Emerald Tablet's role shifted. It was no longer a master key to nature in the same way. It became historical, symbolic, philosophical, occult, poetic, still powerful, but no longer central to the most successful explanations of material change. The furnace remained. The meaning of the furnace changed. For the alchemist, it could be a miniature cosmos. For the chemist, it became part of an experimental system. Heat was no longer only an emblem of purification. It was a variable to be controlled. Vapor was no longer half spirit. It was a state of matter to be investigated. The vessel was no longer only a sealed womb of transformation. It was apparatus. Something was gained. Something was lost. What was gained was precision, reliability, and the ability to build knowledge that did not depend on secret authority. What was lost was the older sense that every material operation belonged to a cosmic drama. Modern chemistry is far better at explaining what happens in a flask. It is less interested in telling us what that flask means to the human soul. Alchemy wanted both. That ambition made it flawed, but also unforgettable. It stood at the threshold between sacred story and experimental practice, between the ancient voice of Hermes and the stubborn silence of matter under heat. When it entered the laboratory, it carried the Emerald Tablet with it, not as a manual on the bench, perhaps, but as a mood of inquiry. Separate, purify, ascend, descend. Return changed. Those were not modern chemical instructions, but they helped generations imagine that transformation could be pursued, not merely witnessed. And in the slow, smoky patience of the laboratory, imagination began to harden into method. It is tempting to imagine alchemy fading away once serious minds arrived. That is the comforting version of history. First came the dreamers, then came the scientists. First came the symbols, then came the measurements. First came Hermes, then came reason, wearing a clean coat and looking slightly embarrassed by the family records. But history is rarely that tidy. Alchemy survived deep into the early modern period, not only among charlatans, patrons, and hopeful amateurs, but among some of the most serious thinkers of their age. The most famous example is Isaac Newton. To many people, that still feels like a contradiction. Newton, the mathematician of motion and gravity, the figure associated with the laws of the physical universe, spending years with alchemical writings. It sounds almost like a flaw in the story, an inconvenient stain on a monument. But perhaps the contradiction belongs more to us than to Newton. For a mind like his, the attraction was not necessarily the crude fantasy of quick gold. It was the possibility of a universal law behind visible change. Newton lived in a world where the boundaries between natural philosophy, theology, chronology, mathematics, optics, and alchemy were not arranged as they are now. He wanted to understand nature at its deepest level, and alchemy claimed that matter itself concealed ancient principles of activity, generation, corruption, and renewal. That claim would have been difficult for him to ignore. The emerald tablet remained attractive in this environment because it seemed to promise exactly what the early modern searcher wanted: unity. A law behind many appearances, a key that could connect matter and motion, heaven and earth, spirit and body, creation and decay. It spoke an ancient language, but its ambition was not small. It suggested that the world's surface diversity could be traced back to a deeper operation. For Newton and others, alchemical texts offered more than recipes. They were archives of possibility. Of course, those archives were treacherous. Alchemical authors hid meanings, contradicted one another, borrowed names, and wrote in symbols that could be rearranged almost endlessly. A serious reader had to compare manuscripts, decode metaphors, test interpretations, and decide which authorities were worth trusting. This was not passive belief. It was a demanding, often exhausting form of reading. Newton's alchemical interests remind us that the birth of modern science did not happen by simply rejecting all older traditions at once. New methods grew beside older hopes. A person could make brilliant mathematical discoveries while still believing that ancient wisdom preserved truths about matter. He could investigate light with extraordinary rigor and also search obscure texts for clues to nature's hidden activity. To modern eyes, that looks divided. To him, it may have looked like one pursuit. The deeper issue is that early modern thinkers were trying to explain activity in nature. What makes matter move? What binds bodies? What causes change? How does invisible force act across visible distance? These questions did not fit neatly into inherited categories. Alchemy, with all its flaws, offered a language of active principles. It imagined matter not as dead stuff, but as something capable of internal transformation. That idea mattered. Even as mechanical philosophy grew stronger, the question of how nature acted remained difficult. Alchemical traditions, with their talk of spirits, principles, attractions, fermentations, and hidden powers, could seem like reservoirs of insight, even when their explanations were not acceptable by later standards. They gave thinkers permission to suspect that visible matter was animated by invisible processes. The emerald tablet, in its compressed way, stood near that suspicion. It described movement between above and below. It spoke of power gathered through ascent and descent. It treated the world as one system of transformation. For a reader hungry for universal order, these were not merely mystical decorations. They were hints, perhaps ancient, perhaps corrupted, perhaps recoverable, of a natural philosophy deeper than ordinary appearances. This is why alchemy did not vanish the moment better instruments appeared. Instruments answer some questions and create others. A telescope can show moons around Jupiter, but it does not tell you what matter is. A prism can reveal the behavior of light, but it does not settle every question about hidden forces. A furnace can transform substances, but the meaning of transformation still depends on theory. Early modern science had to build those theories while surrounded by older languages that had not yet lost all authority. Newton's alchemy belongs to that transitional world. It is not a childish hobby attached to an otherwise rational mind. It is part of a broader effort to find unity beneath phenomena. That effort could produce mathematics of extraordinary clarity in one domain and obscure symbolic labor in another. The same desire for hidden order can lead to equations, experiments, theology, or alchemical manuscripts, depending on the tools and assumptions available. This does not mean the Emerald Tablet secretly contains Newtonian physics. It does not. We should avoid turning the tablet into a magic ancestor for every later discovery. That would repeat the old Hermetic habit of making ancient texts predict whatever the present already values. The point is subtler. The tablet remained meaningful because its promise resembled the early modern hunger for universal explanation. It told readers that the many might be one, that the high and low might obey a shared structure, and that nature's secret could be approached through disciplined interpretation. That was enough. Newton also shows us why the phrase, "last serious alchemists," is complicated. Alchemy did not end because foolish people stopped believing and intelligent people took over. It ended, gradually, because new methods of explanation became more successful, more public, more repeatable, and less dependent on hidden authority. Chemistry learned to speak in measurements, reactions, elements, and later atomic theory. It no longer needed Hermes to legitimate its claims. But during the transition, seriousness and alchemy could still coexist. There were learned practitioners who copied texts carefully, conducted experiments, and believed they were working within a venerable tradition of natural knowledge. Some were wrong in their theories. Some were too credulous about ancient authority. Some may have wasted years chasing symbols that never produced what they promised. But they were not all fools. The decline of alchemy was not the defeat of stupidity by intelligence. It was the replacement of one intellectual ecology by another. In the old ecology, secrecy could signal depth, antiquity could authorize truth, symbol could guide practice. The hidden nature of matter could be approached through a mixture of experiment, analogy, and spiritual discipline. In the new ecology, knowledge gained power by becoming public, testable, quantifiable, and increasingly independent of legendary origins. The Emerald Tablet belonged to the older ecology. That is why it could not remain central forever. Yet it did not simply die. It changed function. As chemistry advanced, the tablet became less useful as a guide to matter and more powerful as a symbol of the human desire for unity. Occultists preserved it. Historians studied it. Spiritual readers reinterpreted it. Artists and poets found in it an image of correspondence. The phrase, "as above, so below," escaped the laboratory and entered broader cultural memory. Newton's presence near the end of alchemy's serious life gives the story a final irony. The man later celebrated for laws of motion also searched through a tradition built on hidden transformations. He stands in this story not as an embarrassment, but as a reminder that knowledge is often born in mixed rooms. The clean categories come later. The living search happens earlier, among inherited symbols, new instruments, old authorities, private doubts, and dangerous hopes. The Emerald Tablet promised a universal law before the world had the tools to find universal laws in a modern way. That is why it attracted minds across centuries, not because it was clear, because it seemed to be pointing. And sometimes, for a serious seeker, a pointing finger from antiquity can be hard to ignore, even when the road beyond it disappears into smoke. After all the chambers, furnaces, manuscripts, symbols, and promises, the mystery begins to change shape. At first, the emerald tablet seems to ask a simple question. Did the object exist? Was there truly a slab of emerald hidden beneath a statue? Did Belinus really descend into a secret chamber? Did an ancient figure hold the words of Hermes in unmoving hands? Was the tablet a physical relic from Egypt, carried somehow through the darkness of history into Arabic and European alchemy? The honest answer is that the legend is stronger than the evidence. We have no confirmed ancient Egyptian emerald slab bearing the tablet's text. We do not have archaeological proof of the discovery scene. The earliest traceable life of the text belongs to written tradition, especially Arabic alchemical transmission, not to a verified object pulled from an Egyptian tomb. The story of the chamber may preserve the emotional truth of how secret wisdom was imagined, but it does not give us a secure historical origin. And yet, calling the legend false is not enough. A false object can still carry a real history. The tablet's power never depended entirely on being emerald. It depended on the few lines attributed to it. Lines compact enough to travel, obscure enough to invite interpretation, and grand enough to suggest a hidden structure behind reality. That was the true artifact. Not a green stone, but a symbolic formula. This is the secret that often gets missed. The emerald tablet survived because it did not need to be one thing. It could be Egyptian in imagination, Arabic in its earliest recoverable written pathway, Hermetic in authority, Latin in transmission, Renaissance in ambition, and modern in afterlife. Each age placed its own hand on the text, and each age found a different kind of treasure there. The legend promised an object. History gives us a transmission. The alchemist sought a stone. The tradition preserved a pattern. That pattern was simple, almost dangerously simple. The universe is connected. The high and low mirror one another. All things arise from one source. Transformation is possible because separation and reunion belong to the structure of nature. Whether read materially, spiritually, philosophically, or poetically, the tablet offered a way to imagine reality as readable. This was more enduring than any physical relic could have been. A real emerald slab might have been lost, stolen, broken, disputed, or locked in a collection. A text can enter memory. It can survive in copies. It can change languages. It can be misunderstood and still remain alive. It can be used by people who disagree about nearly everything except the feeling that something important is hidden inside it. That is what happened. The emerald tablet moved through religions, languages, empires, and intellectual worlds because it was small enough to carry and large enough to absorb meaning. It passed through Arabic scholarship, Latin manuscripts, Renaissance Hermeticism, early modern alchemy, occult philosophy, and eventually the wider symbolic imagination. It was not stable in the way a measured fact is stable. It was stable in the way a powerful metaphor is stable. It kept changing without disappearing. This does not make every interpretation equally valid. Some readings are historically stronger than others. Some are careless. Some are fantasy wearing antique robes. Some are attempts to force the tablet to predict modern science, which usually says more about modern desire than ancient knowledge. A careful reading must separate evidence from romance. But once we make that separation, something more interesting remains. The tablet shows how human beings create continuity from fragments. A short medieval alchemical text can be linked to Hermes, Hermes to Egypt, Egypt to sacred science to the beginning of wisdom. The chain may not hold as literal history, but it reveals a powerful longing. The wish that knowledge was once whole, that the world once spoke plainly, and that the right words might let us hear it again. The secret was not the stone. The secret was the belief that matter itself had a grammar. That belief was strong enough to build laboratories, inspire frauds, discipline observers, confuse scholars, attract philosophers, and haunt some of the greatest minds of the early modern world. It made people look at metals and see planets, at vapors and see spirits, at decay and see the first stage of renewal. It made the world stranger, sometimes too strange, but also more worthy of attention. The Emerald Tablet did not give alchemists the philosopher's stone. It gave them a reason to keep searching. And in history, that may have been the more powerful transmutation. Not lead into gold, but a handful of cryptic sentences into centuries of labor, longing, argument, and imagination. The object in the legend remains unproven. The transformation caused by the legend is not. In the end, the Emerald Tablet leaves us with a promise more unsettling than gold. It says the universe can be read. Not easily, not safely, not by anyone who merely glances at the surface and mistakes mystery for understanding, but read somehow through correspondences, transformations, patterns, and hidden relations. Heaven and earth are not strangers. Matter is not mute. The human soul is not outside the story, looking in through glass. It is part of the same design. That is why the tablet endured. Not because it gave clear instructions. It did not. Not because it proved the philosopher's stone existed. It did not. Not because we can verify the emerald slab of legend, or the hidden chamber, or the ancient figure holding the secret in the dark. We cannot. It endured because it gave form to one of humanity's oldest suspicions, that reality has a concealed structure, and that the visible world is only the outer skin of something deeper. For alchemists, that suspicion became work. They built furnaces. They copied manuscripts. They watched colors change in sealed vessels. They listened to ancient names. They followed symbols through failure after failure, sometimes with discipline, sometimes with vanity, sometimes with genuine insight, sometimes with dangerous self-deception. Their world was not ours, but their desire is still recognizable. They wanted transformation to mean something. They wanted decay to be reversible. They wanted matter to hold a path back to wholeness. And perhaps that is the most human part of the whole story. The Emerald Tablet speaks in cosmic language, but it survives because it touches ordinary fears. We watch things fall apart, bodies weaken, metals corrode, memory fades. Civilizations bury their own knowledge under new languages and new ruins. Against that, the tablet offered a terrifying hope. What is broken may be separated, purified, and joined again. Not always, in fact, but powerfully in imagination. Modern chemistry no longer needs Hermes to explain matter. It has better tools, better methods, and a language built on measurement rather than sacred authority. That is a gain, and not a small one. But the old tablet still reflects something that science alone does not try to answer. Why transformation feels so close to meaning. The alchemist looked into the vessel and saw the world. Sometimes he was wrong. Sometimes he saw only what he wished to see. But sometimes, by looking so intently, he noticed that matter is never as simple as it appears. It changes. It resists. It hides processes beneath surfaces. It rewards patience and punishes arrogance. In that sense, the furnace was a mirror, not only of nature, but of the person standing before it. The real emerald tablet was never just an object. It was a mirror in the dark. A mirror for cultures longing for ancient wisdom. A mirror for scholars trying to unite broken traditions. A mirror for alchemists seeking perfection in metal, medicine, and soul. A mirror for us, still drawn to the idea that beneath the noise of the world, there may be a pattern waiting to be understood. The legend began with a tablet held in ancient hands. The history gives us something quieter. A short text moving through languages, gathering meanings, losing certainty, gaining power. And perhaps that is enough, because the deepest secrets in history are not always hidden because someone locked them away. Sometimes they are hidden because they are too close to us. The Emerald Tablet survived by whispering that the cosmos may be readable. Its final question is whether we can read ourselves with the same care.